Welcome back to Inside College Admissions, a podcast presented by Scoir. My name is Robert Avossa, and I serve as the Superintendent-in-Residence for the Scoir Network. I'm very excited today to be joined by Dr. Dana Godek. Before I introduce Dr. Godek, I wanted to share a little bit about my background. I'm a lifetime teacher and principal and ended my career in public education as a superintendent. I led the 20th largest school system for 5 years in Fulton County, Georgia, and ended my career in public ed running Palm Beach County Schools, which was the 10th largest district in the country. And I'm super pleased to be joined today by Dr. Dana Godek. She is a policy and practice champion. She works with states, districts, and schools from across the country. Her particular area of focus is social and emotional learning, and she works mostly with CASEL, a collaborative of academic, social, and emotional learning. I'm super excited to have her here with me today to talk a little bit more about social emotional learning and what we can do as educators to be prepared for students as they come back to school. Dr. Godek?
Hi, thanks, Dr. Avossa. Thanks for that kind introduction. And I appreciate that you underscored that social and emotional learning is my area of focus, because I think it's everyone's area of focus right now as we're thinking about school reopening, thinking about budget, really taking stock of what our constituents need right now. So thanks for that great welcome.
It is my absolute pleasure. And as we begin thinking about schools across the country reopening face-to-face, and we've heard that the Biden administration is looking at an April deadline to try to get most of the schools across America open. We also know that there are schools that have been open and have been open since September of last year. So there's some good things that we can learn from those who are out ahead of us and those who are looking to open face-to-face for the first time. But all of this is contingent on our ability to fund schools, keep them safe, and make sure that teachers and staff feel comfortable coming back. You know, a lot of money has been invested since this COVID crisis has started. Can you talk with me a little bit about funding? I know it's a major issue and a major topic for school district leaders. What are your thoughts about that?
Sure, appreciate that. Good question. So there's definitely a deluge of funding and some concerns about spending it well, spending it strategically and not tactically. You know, there's some go-to responses that we could use that maybe fill a day-to-day operational need. But thinking long term and like the, playing to win kind of philosophy, this is an opportunity and a moment to really rethink the way that we are conducting instruction, definitely keeping kids safe, both emotionally and physically, and thinking through a little bit about how we're equipping our local teams through some guidance that our states are releasing. So very much appreciate that question. The two biggest buckets that we see most federal resources used on is on people and technology. So it's one thing to, attempt to close the digital divide with technology. Definitely appreciate that and applaud that. And it's another thing to think about personnel and those human capital resources and what those teams look like. So we could certainly hire a bunch more instructional coaches, maybe backfill some vacancies. But what's front and center in front of all school communities right now is our emotional health. So really thinking about what those leadership teams for social emotional learning can look like at a district level and at a schoolhouse level is an important moment for pause and reflection so that we're really amping up those teams and their skills and strengths so they're supporting the schools and teachers.
I get it. And I think, again, as a former superintendent, the way I look at it is in stages. So stage one, we needed to go out and purchase equipment, PPE, and equipment, I mean technology, computers. We may have purchased software. That spending phase has come to an end. And so now the next piece is, what do we do to support people as they come back to school? My fear is, though, that, and I tell people, be careful about using one-time money for ongoing expenses. So if you're hiring a lot of full-time employees, will there be a funding cliff 2 years from now when the CARES Act money dries up? So that's just a caution there as well to my school district leader friends that are listening in. I do want to continue, though, on this discussion about best practice in reopening. I know a lot of materials have been put out there by different agencies. I think I, again, go back to this notion that people need not reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of big foundations across the country that have invested in putting materials together for people, including, you can Google this if you're listening in. Chiefs for Change has put together what's called a day in the life of protocol, and there are a ton of resources there. Just Google Chiefs for Change. It's a free resource. They've been funded. They're a bipartisan educational leadership group. But Dana, talk a little bit more about this notion of best practice in reopening.
Yeah, thanks again for that. And very much appreciate the reference to Chiefs for Change, who also has honored social and emotional learning for school leaders as well as school staff. And that's really consistent with other guidance that we're seeing, like coming out of the American Academy of Pediatrics, or AAP. So, in tandem with the CDC, they have released some key principles. And that's really taking a critical eye to school policies and making sure that they're adjusted to align with new information about the pandemic. We see district leaders and school leaders being very responsive in that state, and really thinking about a multi-pronged or a layered approach to the way that they're protecting students and teachers. And what I think AAP means by that multi-pronged layered approach is, one, being in close communication with teachers and definitely with families. And we see some great examples of that, leveraging social media and other forms of communication, but also two, really thinking through like what kinds of supports they're going to need based on input from teachers, based on input from families. So it's really important to develop some strategies on keeping positivity high, right? And layering approaches that will allow for children to feel welcome, comfortable back in buildings. And we see lots of good leading examples of that for districts and schools that have already reopened for brick and mortar instruction. And we're starting to see some high quality examples coming out of the virtual or hybrid space. So that's really encouraging. But the key to all of that is having some policy around support for social emotional learning, and communicate, and coaching our teachers to communicate as well.
And you bring up a good point. Leadership in all cases is an important component of managing change and managing crises. People look to leaders to, garner whether or not they should be scared or they should be worried, right? So if the leadership, whether it's a school principal, a team leader in a department, is calm, is confident, and is assuring them that things are going to be okay, we all feel a little bit better. So leadership's a big piece of that, and having a champion around making sure we're looking after one another and not just talking about social emotional learning and wellness, but actually living it out in our daily lives.
Absolutely. Thanks for pausing to reflect on the leader. And I would encourage everyone listening to pause and think about themselves in this leadership moment. To your point, Robert, like high quality leadership is about bringing order to chaos and inspiring others to feel confident and calm. So we have to reflect a little bit on whether or not we're confident or calm, and use some very distinct techniques to get us into that space of balance, so that when we are communicating or are in front of our constituents, we are projecting a high level of emotional intelligence and self-awareness. If you're curious about emotional intelligence, I would encourage you to just Google Dan Goleman. He is a researcher who has spent a lot of time and effort in researching emotional intelligence in both the public education space and in multiple industries, and was also, by the way, a founding partner for CASEL, for the organization that I support. So just on that point, just a quick tip as a leader and thinking about the neuroscience of leadership's emotional intelligence in this space. If you're getting in front of a group of constituents, the best quick in the moment tip I can give you is breathe. And it sounds like a little esoteric, but it's rooted in neuroscience. So there is something called the vagus nerve, which connects our brain to our gut. And I hear a lot of leaders say, oh, I'm operating off my gut instinct, or I'm responding to the situation. That's for real. And what is happening there is your brain is telling your stomach something's right, something's wrong. It happens to be the longest nerve in our body for good reason, because it really guides our gut instincts and what we're perceiving and interpreting in the environment in an implicit way. So the best way to get the vagus nerve in check is to breathe. That is a scientific fact. 5 deep breaths before you get in front of a parent community, a teacher community, provide some support and just positive encouragement of students or others. Just 5 deep breaths calms the system down so that you're able to project that high level of emotional intelligence. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Well, Dr. Godek, I brought in a free set of resources when I was superintendent in Palm Beach called Pure Edge, Pure Edge. And they've got 5 or 6 breathing techniques. Again, you can Google this, take a look at it. I used to start my principal meetings by having people do one of 5 breathing techniques that they teach you to get them also grounded in the conversations we're about to have. So they're more prepared to have deep conversations about teaching and learning and feel confident, et cetera. And again, that's a good way for you to lead by example, because people now are running from meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting and don't have an opportunity to just reconnect in the moment and focus really 100% on the topic at hand. So I appreciate that. Well, we only have about 5 minutes left, and I'd like to talk about this notion of pivoting to personalization. We've talked about personalization for a really long time.
Yeah.
And what that looks like continues to evolve in teaching and learning, but also have read recently a lot about ownership and this notion of autonomy. I know you and I've had conversations about agency and agentic learning. These are all things that are coming back to the forefront. The Montessori movement over 100 years ago was all about students making choices about the things that they wanted to do and how they wanted to learn. And yet 100 years later, we're still grappling with that. So let's pivot over to this notion of ownership and autonomy. What are your thoughts about that? What are you seeing in the field? Are people feeling more comfortable talking about this? And how does it layer into the social emotional framework that you deal with on a regular basis?
Yeah, thanks for that. And I want to give you a little bit of credit. We talked a lot about bringing mindfulness practices in Palm Beach, but the other thing that you led really strongly on in multiple places, in multiple superintendencies, is this notion of personalization, personalized learning. We see that playing out nationally through project-based learning, which unites a couple of really fascinating things, right? So drawing from Maria Montessori and those philosophical approaches, also drawing from authentic assessment. And that's not to disparage at all teachers' ability to gauge in the moment how a student is doing and what to instructionally coach to. And last but not least, this notion of student agency or agentic learning, as you've described, right? So that's all about encompassing anything from letting the student choose and decide what their learning plan is going to be with some, support and coaching, and how they're going to access that content and organize their own learning, right? So they are empowered over their own direction. They have the power to navigate their learning map, their learning journey, based on some high quality evidence-based materials within the room. So yeah, I love that you've brought that up. We see that crystallizing again through project-based learning as a strong practice where students are given a set of options to think through for a real world problem to solve. And guess what that does? It really unites social and emotional learning, agentic learning or student empowerment, and instructional practice into one like ball, if you will, into one sort of approach. So teachers that are really maximizing this moment and some of that flexibility in a hybrid environment are getting some really strong results there.
That's exciting. I often think about the people in school buildings like counselors, social workers, psychologists, folks who aren't in the classroom every day per se teaching with students. How might they contribute? I often use the example of security. Security on a campus is not just the police officer or the resource officer's responsibility. It's everybody's responsibility. If a door is unlocked, lock it. And social emotional learning and wellness and this notion of helping children, especially in this COVID world and post-COVID world, hopefully soon, these folks on campus, these sort of social workers, guidance counselors, and others, counselors, how do they contribute to that? And feel like they're not the only ones who really own that, but help develop the kind of culture on a campus, the kind of things that we want to see. Is it a college-going atmosphere that we're trying to create, or whatever the local community is doing in that space? How might they help?
Yeah, so I would put that in the category of coalition building, right? So building supports or a coalition within a school, within a campus to help support social and emotional learning under the banner that is right for the community. So that could be college and career readiness. We see lots of great examples about that on Portrait of a Graduate work at both the state, district, and schoolhouse level. So there's a few different ways to frame that. At the end of the day, we really want the social workers and the clinicians to do just that, to focus on mental health support, clinical practice at the tier 2 and tier 3 level, but to distribute some of those practices at the tier 1 level. So those universal practices, so everybody on a school campus is taking part in contributing to the climate. And my handy dandy tip for that is, again, mindfulness. So we have this temptation of thinking about the next 3 things that we have to do when we're walking down the hall. And it's a good practice to be proactive and anticipate the moment. And we also need to be present in the moment, right? As we're seeing someone who may be displaying some signs of stress, whether that's emotional stress, or maybe there's something in the environment that seems off. To your point, the door might be unlocked or open, or there's just something wrong in the environment. Going back to that vagus nerve, really honoring those instincts, being present in the moment while you're thinking about what those next 2-3 things are that are coming up down the hallway.
Well, it has been an absolute privilege to speak with you more about this. I want to thank everybody for joining us today on this Inside College Admissions episode. We do hope that you find our discussions helpful, and we look forward to continuing that conversation in our part 3 of 3 with Dr. Dana Godek.
Thank you, Robert. Very much humbled by being here with you today, and I'm wishing everyone the absolute best for a strong start to a new school year.